A long time ago, I discovered that the Crocker has an outstanding collection of drawings, but also too, it's where I first saw some really great prints and drawings up close. I said to myself, if I'm able to, someday I'm going to help the Crocker. And I wasn't actually sure it was going to happen, but what I promised myself is I would try. Really good things keep coming up for sale. And so all you have to do is be patient.
It gives me really great pleasure to introduce William Brazil, who's going to be part of our team with Alan Templeton to give you a wonderful talk today about the, as from a philanthropist point of view, the Crocker collection and what Alan has been able to provide. But William was trained at the National Gallery of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He has organized many exhibits here, and with a PhD from the University of Maryland and a dissertation in Italian sketchbooks, he is the author of articles on master drawings, including Old Masters in Old California. In addition to coordinating many of the major exhibits that we have here in the catalogs, he has organized exhibits on Italian paintings, European and American prints for the Crocker, as well as coordinating curator for many loaned exhibitions. And he's really our expert in our wonderful collection of printed materials and old masters. So without further ado, I would like to present to you William Brazil.
So I'm here to sit down and have a conversation with Alan Templeton, and many of you have met him, but just to remind you, Alan is a longtime investor and occasional guest curator. He most recently co-curated the Berkeley Art Museum's presentation of the Gray collection of drawings that was on display in autumn of 2021. He has also exhibited his own artwork in the 1980s onward and was represented by the Vorpal Gallery of San Francisco. He has previously worked as an administrator at a labor union and many years ago taught English at a high school in Boston. His parents, David and Lilo, were both physical chemists at UC Berkeley for their entire careers. Since 2019, Alan has been a trustee of the UC Berkeley Foundation, and in recent years he's focused more on philanthropy with special attention to the humanities at UC Davis and UC Berkeley and support for several of the art museums of Northern California. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree at UC Davis in 1982, where he majored in both art history and psychology, and then did a year of graduate work in art history at Boston University, where he studied the fine arts of 18th century Europe with Dr. Alice Binion. He was also on the staff of the Boston University Art Gallery, where he first learned to curate art exhibits. He has regularly visited the Crocker since 1980 and has always especially admired its collection of European drawings and the beauty of its historic architecture. He's lived in Oakland for many years, just a very few miles from where he grew up. So please join me in welcoming Alan Templeton.
Thank you. Oh.
So here we are, and let me just test a moment to see if we can move forward. Oh, we can. How
very
wonderful.
good.
Okay. And before we really sort of start talking about this lovely painting here, I was wondering how this all started, because you became involved with the Crocker Art Museum well before I came on staff in 2005. And in fact, some of the things that we'll talk about are, of course,
from that period before my tenure.
It's true, and actually, I've always loved art, and I've drawn since I was a child, and unlike many children, I never stopped drawing. But what really drew me to the great art of the past, it started because we lived in France for 6 months. So I went to the 3rd grade in Grenoble, France. And on that trip, this is back when air travel was enjoyable. So this was December 68 through June 69. And at that time my father got a grant to be at the University of Grenoble for that time. But we had a TWA ticket which allowed for unlimited stops anywhere in Europe, with the end point being Vienna. So we went all over, and the first museum I ever went to was the Prado in Madrid. And I didn't know the names of the artists then, but what really stuck in my mind, I figured it out later, were the works of Velázquez and Goya. So that's not a bad place to start. And what I told myself, I was only 8.5, but I told myself, okay, I'm going to pay attention to these places called art museums. And then when I went to college at Davis, I took classes in lots of different things, but I became fascinated both by psychology and art history. And with art history, I had had the opportunity to see some of the great masterpieces in person, thanks to my parents, because we went to Europe 3 times when I was growing up. But it's also what ultimately led me to want to help the Crocker is that many of my fellow enthusiasts among the students who cared a lot about art history, many of them had never been to Europe. They had never been to any of the great museums back east. They only knew art through reproductions. And it's actually here, about 1980 or 81, I remember, there used to be these wonderful small exhibits in the library gallery, very small scale, where now the Meissen is beautifully displayed. But there would be small exhibits of works on paper. And that's when I discovered that the Crocker has an outstanding collection of drawings, but also, too, it's where I first saw some really great prints and drawings up close. When I had gone to museums with my family, we mainly looked at painting and sculpture, and even though I had always drawn, I hadn't been to a lot of drawing exhibits. Then I realized the Crocker, now this is a long time ago, mind you, the Crocker is sort of this sleepy treasure house, which a lot of people seem to take for granted. I thought it was fantastic, but not very many people in the early 80s were visiting day to day, and they had really interesting things. So I said to myself, if I'm able to, someday I'm going to help the Crocker. And I wasn't actually sure it was going to happen, but what I basically promised myself is I would try. And originally, and you'll see this with some of the things we show, when I first came forward about 22 years ago to actively help the Crocker, I was thinking, okay, I'll focus on prints and drawings. And I was initially thinking I can probably fill some of the gaps in the European collection in prints and drawings, because there are lots of prints and drawings out there. And some things are very good that are not expensive, so I'll see what I can do. And then apparently I cannot stop.
Yes, and we're glad you haven't. Well, let's take a moment and talk about this thing that you didn't
Right.
give. Yeah.
I was not alive in 1872.
Yes. So this is our Peter Brondel, an artist from Prague.
Yes.
And this actually has to do with not acquisitions, but a different area.
That's right. I think conservation is really important and often gets the least amount of attention. For some reason, it's not seen as glamorous. But I can tell you from years of experience, the easiest way to improve a collection of old master paintings is to remove the dirty varnish. Start there. It's not that expensive. There's still plenty of people in the world who know how to clean things properly. A good cleaning and some discreet touch-up makes a world of difference. This, which the Crockers bought, is, I would argue, and believe me, I've looked, this is the finest Czech Baroque painting in America, and it's upstairs. But when I was younger, you couldn't even see the background because it was that dirty. I didn't know there was a chalice.
You know, before conservation, you couldn't see this, which is part of the whole point. It's part of the iconography of the painting, and it sort of it sort of ties it directly to the words of Scripture.
Yes.
In ways that, were not clear before.
No, and it's beautiful.
It really is quite beautiful.
I thought it was a dark painting that was meant to be dark, the tenebrous tradition. No, actually, it's not a dark picture. And that's another thing that was such an eye-opener, that it's a beautiful painting, and it just needed a little bit of attention.
So we're very lucky that, and believe me, conservation can be difficult to raise money for, because it's not like, you don't get your name on it as much, as a new building or a new whatever it is. So it's an extremely important area.
We need to make conservation sexier. And so if anyone has a suggestion, I'm all ears. But it makes a huge difference.
Well, speaking of sexy.
Oh, yeah. Right, so we're going chronological by how I have given things. This is one of the first things I gave, and I love Hogarth. And actually, the first time I ever saw his prints in person was here at the Crocker over 40 years ago, a small exhibit in the library gallery. And they showed two series of prints, a Rake's Progress and a Harlot's Progress, both given by Anne and Malcolm McHenry, who have been stalwart supporters for decades. And so he's an example of someone I only knew from the books, and they're so much more beautiful in person. I wanted to give some of the print series by Hogarth also because I think they're really good for teaching, because you have to decipher what's going on in each scene, and he purposely leaves you lots and lots of clues. And also his humor is unmistakable and very 18th century. And so I actually think, by the way, if you want to get people to come to the museum who think that they're not going to have a good time, show them something that has a sense of humor. And that's a good way in. But Hogarth, I think, is endlessly fascinating. And this is one of my old-time favorites. And it's also, it's designed by Hogarth. The paintings were by Hogarth, but the engravings were almost always made by talented engravers he hired, who meticulously followed his design. And he was smart enough to know his limitations. So he hired a lot of good, often French engravers, and also some from Holland and Flanders, to do the hard work. And the result speaks for itself.
Well, and the prints collection is something that you've been very interested in over the years, and this is extremely charming.
I've always loved, I love Mary Cassatt. She's one of those people I wish I could have met in person. I think she was extremely interesting and a good example of a woman of a certain time who would not take no for an answer, and who knew she wanted a career in art as a professional, and she made it happen. And she also became a trusted advisor to many American collectors. And I love her art so much, and especially 20 years ago, I definitely could not have afforded a painting. And they've only gotten more expensive. But she also was extremely good at printmaking. And I do think the benefit of prints is that you can see a really good artist at work. Some of the best artists ever made prints, but it's still more affordable, and that means a much wider audience can see why she's such a good artist. I think it really helps to have a good print collection. I think the Crocker family bought a lot of really good drawings. They were very astute about that, and they bought some good paintings, and they did a huge thing by creating this museum, but they didn't buy much in the way of prints. And so I thought early on, this is the easiest way to help the Crocker.
And you know, it's interesting. My job is actually sort of shaped very differently from some of my colleagues, because the Crocker's print collection is not as strong as the drawings collection, and in
Right.
most museums, it's the reverse. So at the Met, for example, they have 1 million prints and like 100,000 drawings, or you know, some large number. But just to give you the sort of, that's a typical sort of proportion. But it's, you know, the prints collection is something that I've wanted to build since I was here, because there have been things to come in over the years before I came here, this being one of them, of course, that have sort of created a core that we can draw on in the future. And so it's something that's very important. But I wanted to ask a little bit about this.
Yeah.
So Erwin Stoltz, as we'll see, and as we've already seen with the Brondel, many of the things that you've been interested in have some relationship to Central Europe.
Yes.
And we're, of course, you know, one of a few museums in the US that are very good in Central European, that is German and Austrian, painting of the 19th century. But do you have other things that sort of draw you, personal reasons or other things
Yes.
that sort of draw you towards that part of the world?
I've always been fascinated by Central Europe, and that goes back to my mom was from Central Europe. And so she spent her childhood in Breslau, in Silesia, which used to be part of Germany, it's now part of Poland. And my mom and her family, it's one of the many families that was a prosperous Jewish family that had to leave because of the Nazis. And fortunately, they were able to leave promptly in 1933 because a friend of theirs who worked at Breslau City Hall tipped off my grandparents that my grandmother, not my grandfather, my grandmother was about to be arrested by the Gestapo because she was considered politically suspect. Now, I knew her as a small child, and any government that thinks my grandmother was a threat to them is a very bad government. But it does mean that they were able to leave when it was easy to leave. My mom was tough as nails. And so you'll see there are a number of women artists that I've given works for who are strong personalities. My mom was one of those strong personalities. And, but the one thing that was always a sore point for her was the fact that when she was 14, she had to leave Breslau and she never saw it again. And it was badly damaged in the war, and it was wrenching for her, that whole experience. And then we visited Europe together several times. It was always interesting to go to German-speaking Europe with my mom because then she could speak her first language. English was her third language. And she was very good at it. But when we would be somewhere in Germany, Austria, and then she would start talking to someone, I saw more what it would have been like for her if things had been different and she could have had a life where she's from. And she loved California. But her main criticism was that at times California is not quite as civilized as she would have liked. And so those, the antidote to that is having afternoon coffee in a very nice cafe in Vienna. That goes a long way.
Right.
And it made me, so since childhood, I just have been, among other things, fascinated by the cosmopolitan nature of Central Europe. So she grew up in one of the cities that was both culturally German-speaking and Polish-speaking. It was Catholic and Jewish and Protestant. There are all these places in Central Europe that have these very complicated interweavings of different people. And the place that has all of that plus keeps producing really interesting art is Vienna. And so the fact is, from my mom's point of view, Breslau was ruined first by the Nazis, then by the Polish communists. Vienna, remarkably, is still relatively intact. And so Vienna was one of those places that my mom really loved visiting, because it felt close to what she had lost. Mm-hmm. But it also means that 20 years ago, when I started helping the Crocker, I was thinking maybe I can do something to bolster the Central European collection and fill some of the holes, the parts where the Crockers weren't able to get to, either because of when they lived or because of their taste. And so I'm trying to fill it out some. And so having been a visitor to Vienna, and having been there especially the first 3 times with my parents, I can tell you that Vienna is what my mom liked about Central Europe, and it's also what she hated about it. And so I'm from one of those many families that has a very complicated relationship with Central Europe. It's come a long way, but if you ever watch that film, Woman in Gold, and the way that the key character has a certain ambivalence about going back, that's the kind of family I'm from, where it's the cultural pride and the deep suspicion that maybe the wrong people are still running things. So, but the art is fascinating, and it's still possible to find things from Central Europe, and not just Vienna, all of it, that are of good quality, that have artistic interest, and there's always a historic backdrop.
And it's something that actually, the Crocker collection supports.
Yes.
Because with our 18th century German drawings, which, we had the exhibition a year ago, and then with sort of bringing things a little bit forward into the 19th and 20th centuries is a way, it's a very interesting sort of area, and it's a way to sort of, as you say, fill some gaps.
It turned out to be an easy way to help, and it's really it's the Crocker, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the Bush Reisinger at Harvard, to a certain degree St. Louis. Those are the only places in America that I know of that are really strong in Central European art. Because for a long time it was very profoundly out of fashion.
Profoundly, yes. Well, let's have a look at Piranesi.
Yes.
And this is part of a sort of bigger group.
Yes. Piranesi is one of the people I became fascinated with, starting when 40 years ago when I studied with Dr. Alice Binion at Boston University, because she's a real expert on the 18th century, but especially in Italy and France. And I owe a lot to her because she showed me how profoundly interesting the 18th century is, and she really took us far into Italian and French art. And so Piranesi is from Venice. Even though we always associate him with Rome, he grew up in Venice, but he spent his career in Rome. And I think one of the fascinating things about him is that he's looking at Rome the way a Venetian would, in that he turns everything into a stage set, into a performance. He exaggerates, he lies. This is also very Venetian. You play things up. Many tourists who knew his prints and then went to Rome were disappointed by Rome because it looks better in the prints. And so I have a deep appreciation of what he was trying to do. The details are beautifully rendered and sometimes very accurate, but the staging is Piranesi. It's even the pictures which are supposed to be realistic, it's still a capriccio to a certain degree. It's still partly invented. But also, too, and this is why I asked that we show this one, it's the Pantheon, but it's not a view of the Pantheon you normally see. So it's the entrance portico, and you're looking back. You're not seeing the dome. You're not seeing the front. He forces you to see things anew. And Rome is still benefiting from the tourist trade. It's partly due to him. So I think, in a way, he would have done extremely well in Hollywood.
Well, and you can see some of his, well, if we point out some of his either sort of embellishments, changes, whatever they are, the very proportion of the figures are much, much smaller than actual people when they're in this space, which, after all, it's a human-sized space. I mean, it's not this sort of incredible sort of looming thing above the figures. But there's that. There's also the sort of angles where he's sort of giving you a sort of backdrop with columns, and then it's
absolutely.
a very unusual view. And then even the surroundings have, various little sort of additions to make it more picturesque, which is, it's Venetian, it's also Roman, but
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, it sort of makes it sort of a separate experience from the experience of the Pantheon.
Yes.
I mean, he's sort of going for something else, or in addition to.
Very much so, and I'm very glad my parents took me to Rome before I ever saw Piranesi.
Right.
So
yeah.
I actually had a basis of comparison.
Well, and there's our next object sort of connects Central Europe and Italy, things that we've been talking about, because this artist, being from Central Europe, ends up in Rome and sort of spends really most of his career there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, very.
He's very interesting. This is Adolf Hieronymi Hirschel. He's from Hungary, but when he was 18, he got into the Art Academy in Vienna, and this is one of his student drawings at the Academy. So he was probably about 20 years old when he drew this. He's already very accomplished. He was imagining he's going to have this great career in Vienna. And then things are going around swimmingly. He gets the Rome Prize. He gets to spend 3 years in Rome. He comes back. He starts getting good commissions. But then this is very Central European, he makes a huge mistake, which is he marries a woman who is English, Protestant, and divorced. And I'm not sure which of those is worse from a Viennese point of view, but 3 strikes and you're out. And so they made the very intelligent decision to relocate to Rome. And so this is the thing about Rome. So it's about 1898 that they settle in Rome. And they fit in well because nobody cares where they're from. And he's a good artist. And Rome is, at that time now, more in the background in terms of contemporary art. And so he had a great career in Rome.
Yeah. Lots of frescoes, lots of
big
fun stuff.
Big projects, and never looked back. But this is another thing I'm sometimes interested in, is seeing where people start. It's interesting to see people on the way up. And someone who grew up in Hungary and was educated in Vienna, it's an unlikely trajectory. But he had a very good career, and I would say maybe his art makes more sense in Rome than it does in Central Europe, some of it.
Yeah, I would think so.
But
because I couldn't see him sort of fitting in with the secession artists,
No.
or, one of the artists we'll be talking about later, who's a contemporary,
Right.
more or less. And he's a really great draftsman.
Yes.
And that's, and this is a student work, and then there's other works, later that have,
It's true. He draws beautifully, and regardless of medium, I often gravitate towards people who can draw better than I do. And I actually draw pretty well, but I've done lots of figure drawings. I don't quite have this level of mastery. Yeah. So this is Rafaela Kikiewicz. She is another one of those women who had a career despite the odds. She was probably born about 1880, although I tried really hard. I cannot find her dates. She's very poorly documented. This is the thing, there are good artists who are still poorly documented. But she was born around 1880, and she was very active in the early 20th century in Vienna. And she excels at portraiture, and she's one of those people who's been unfairly overlooked.
And, you know, I wonder actually, is this a Central European sitter, or is it from a trip to Italy? Because the headdress is very much the sort of woman of the Campagna, etc.
It fits into that, but it could also be, I've thought that it might actually be someone from like the Slovak countryside. It's unclear, but I'm sure she was certainly aware of all those wonderful depictions of Italian peasant women in traditional. So I think it's more likely the sitter is Central European, but she's very aware of the art that has been made by others that is romanticizing the Italian countryside. So,
yeah, and there's a certain number of people who do that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in the 18th century German drawings collection, there are landscapes that you swear would be in Italy, and actually, in point of fact, they were made in Germany by a German,
absolutely,
of a German scene, just in an Italian style. So there's that sort of Central Europe and Italy interaction has a lot of different levels in a lot of different periods, which is interesting.
It's true, and lots of people from Central Europe at some point went to Italy to learn, as many people from throughout Northern Europe did. And there is a lot of back and forth.
Yeah. Well, and now for something completely different.
Yeah. Okay, so this is Kunisada. So I love the woodblock, the color woodblock prints. And it's in the 19th century that it came to a very high level of technical skill and innovation. And actually, so Kunisada is my favorite Japanese artist. And he did these tremendously complex works where it takes many, many blocks. You have all the different colors, very intricate designs. And so this is just one of many Kunisada prints I gave the Crocker so that they would have. It's another area where the Crocker was weak is in Japanese prints. There are some other lovely things in the collection, but I figured I could really do something with Kunisada. And a lot of his work is still available. He's extremely good. His reputation was really high in the late 19th, early 20th century. In our time, he's been overshadowed by Hiroshige and Hokusai. But for his contemporaries, he was at the top. And he's also one of the people who had a big influence on a lot of European artists of the late 19th century. And I just find him endlessly fascinating. Plus, it's a depiction, one of his many depictions from The Tale of Genji, that foundational Japanese novel from 1,000 years ago, which never goes out of fashion, and which artists throughout the ages have tried to bring to life. And I think Kunisada is particularly good at finding clever ways to depict scenes, and also, too, there's always an undercurrent of humor. It's something that connects Kunisada without meaning to. It connects him to Hogarth, to many European artists. Gavarni is this undercurrent of satire and humor.
Yeah, well, and for the print collection, this group is very important, not only because it gives depth, I mean, being able to examine one important artist in depth, as we're now able to do, it's also very important for technique, because that's something that we, when we do have print exhibitions, for example, the Holsius exhibition a few years ago, that's something that we like to be able to look at, demonstrate, etc., because how something is made is, fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's one of the best ways into an artistic medium. So for this one, each of the colors there's a separate block for each of the colors. Each of those is hand inked. So this sort of ombre effect here, this is purely from inking the purple block. And then in many prints, there's also blocks that print blind to create texture. So it's really, it's really a very important thing, not only for the Asian collection, but just the print collection in general.
It's true, and a number of the gifts I'm hoping can be useful to teachers.
Yes, and we do, that's one of the things that I've been very pleased with is the number of studio classes, art history classes that sort of request to come here for sessions, and it's especially nice when there's a visiting printmaker at Davis, because which there has been for a few years. There's been several, and so we're able to sort of exploit that part of the collection and educate in that way.
Absolutely.
So this brings up
Right.
another thing. Well, of course, it's Gilry, so it's there's the humor factor, same as with Hogarth, but in a very different way.
Oh, he's ruthless. So anyone who was visible in English high society in the late 18th, early 19th century was at some point lampooned by Gilry and his contemporaries. So this is the Earl and the Countess of Derby visiting the pre-sale exhibit at Christie's. So something you can still do. And this is the Countess who was formerly the actress Elizabeth Farren. So her own life story is one of those rags to riches stories.
Sort of like the Hamilton.
Yes.
Lady Hamilton.
Right, that's right. They were the object of both admiration and ridicule. And you'll see. I mean, I do like serious art also, but there's something really compelling. I actually think that the 18th to 19th century is probably the high point in the Western tradition for ridiculing people eloquently.
Well, and things like this enormous plume. Yeah, and I think that somebody should make a movie about Lady Derby, just as they did Lady Hamilton.
Yes. Oh, she's extremely interesting.
But this also brings up another thing, which, of course, where they are, dealers, auction houses, etc. And I'm just, of course, we've sort of navigated some of these things together, but I'm wondering about how, navigating the opportunities and the pitfalls of the market,
right,
and sort of how that, some of your experiences there.
It's been extremely interesting. When I was younger, I was very intimidated by the auction houses and by the major European galleries. But what I realized, I was in my early 40s when I first started going in person and more actively and asking questions and being visible to those professionals. And what I realized is that All you have to do is show that you're genuinely interested, that you've done your homework, and that you're not a tourist and you're not some intermediary trying to flip things, but you genuinely care about the art and you're trying to do something, and they light up. So you have to show sincere interest and you have to do your homework. But what has happened over time is that the professionals I do know on the commercial side, they like talking to me because they know that my interest is sincere and not going away. And so if you show respect for them and you ask good questions and you appreciate what they're offering, they will go out of their way to help you. What they hate are people who show up, who don't really know anything, and who look at the name and don't really look at the art. What they love is you show up and you really look and something catches your eye and then you ask questions about it and you have some frame of reference for it, and then they want you to be around. They want you to be one of the people that they offer things to. So I actually thought that the commercial side of the art world would be much more preoccupied with how wealthy you are, how important you are, if you're famous at all. No, they don't care. What they do care about is that you're genuinely interested and from time to time you can buy something, and that you buy things that you really like and you're not treating it as just one more place to park money.
Or also, some of those people that, I've heard, many of some of our mutual dealer friends complain about are the people who, they really just want something pretty to put over the couch.
Yeah.
Right. And that's lovely, but does it need to be,
No, it's
a
a problem.
It can be.
People are buying for different reasons.
Right.
And so the fact is, if you buy something really good and you have a fantastic couch, that's fine. But I actually think what's really driving them crazy is people show up, they pretend to be somewhat interested, then they say, oh yeah, I love that, I'll come back. They don't come back. Then they come another time, they say, well, can I take it home for a while? Okay. And then they say, oh, no, I don't like it, I'm giving it back. And then they say, I really, really like this one. No, can't do it. Or some people are indecisive. Some people are just awful.
Well, and then there are those people, I'm sure that, the people that you're talking about who sort of, I'd love to live with that for a bit to see whether I want to. Of course, they probably had a dinner party in the meantime where they are impressing all their friends, right?
Absolutely.
So, but in any case, it's very interesting, and also sort of different areas of the market.
Yes.
That things are, there are sort of areas that very fashionable people congregate in.
Yeah.
And, really, at least for me, the areas that I've been interested in are not generally where the fashionable people congregate. Right. And I think that's actually sort of an advantage. I don't know whether you feel the same.
It's a huge advantage, and I think it actually would have been much harder if I had tried to do what I've done for the Crocker, if I had been doing it in the 1980s. There were still at that time a lot of people who are high up in society who were buying things that I like. And fortunately, their children are buying things I don't like. So this is the part that really is luck, is that I became prosperous at a time when the prevailing taste went downhill. And I'm talking about especially European art. And in fact, the other benefit of that, which I didn't understand at an earlier time, is that what happens over and over again is you have often a couple who create a fantastic collection that they spent decades building up, that they feel strongly about, which their children and grandchildren played around. and have memories of. And then they pass away, and it's either the children or grandchildren who decide that they really don't want all this old art to worry about, and so they sell it. And it happens over and over again. And so it actually, throughout, I would say, especially the last 25 years, really good things keep coming up for sale. And so all you have to do is be patient. And even if you don't have a great fortune, if you're persistent, over time you do find very good things that you can acquire. And so I think being well-informed and being patient, that's how you build a good collection. And it's true, and all you have to do is stay away from like the 10 most famous old masters, and it becomes a whole lot more affordable. I think something that's happened actually, just especially more so than ever in the last 20 years, is that some of the old master paintings that go for really high amounts, it has to be something that will impress people at your dinner party who never had an art history course. So it's sort of like going to Yosemite, and if you are able to walk more than 3 miles, the crowd dissipates. So you just have to be able to go a little bit farther, and there are great things. Yeah. So we'll probably have to go a little bit faster for
I was
some
about
of the
to
drawings,
say, yeah.
unfortunately, but we'll show you several here in a row that are. So again, we're back in Central Europe. I'm sorry, but I do have this obsession. There are a lot of good. That was Melcher. This is Kalaus. So this is 2 of the many very good artists active in especially the Austrian Empire. And now this is Gavarni, based in Paris, one of the great satirists of the 19th century who, in his body of work, he draws very well and beautiful watercolors, but always underlying it is satire and social critique. So this is, en voilà un bon petit bourgeois. So that's like saying, here's a nice little merchant we can rob. That's the message.
Yeah, that's why they have those sticks, etc. Yeah.
So be careful. And this is the first painting I ever gave to the Crocker. It was in 2005. Dannhauser, who was one of the great artists in the first half of the 19th century in Vienna. You'll see it upstairs. The subtlety in person is tremendous and beautifully rendered. Here, so I do want to spend a moment on this. So this is by Countess Antonia Batyan. This is actually drawn when she was still single, so it's really Antonia Zici. She's from one of the most important Hungarian families, and she fell in love with someone from one of the other important Hungarian families. And so this was likely drawn in the summer of 1834. It's probably, the landscape is probably her family's estate. The ruin is probably largely imagined. And she's actually a very good artist, but it's an example of another subcategory where I've tried at times to offer things that are by good artists who purposely never became professional artists.
Yeah.
So just because you're not a professional doesn't mean you're not good.
Right, yes. Well, and then she had a whole lot of other responsibilities with 8 children and then being the wife of the first Hungarian prime minister.
Yes, and her husband was then, after 10 months as prime minister, arrested by the Austrians because they were worried he was going to foment a revolution. Other people did foment a revolution, which he wasn't directly responsible for, but he was executed. And she spent her very long widowhood being an advocate and symbol of Hungary's defiance. And so she's a revered figure in Hungary to this day. So here again, it's interesting to see her early. This is Raffaella again, Raffaella Kikiewicz. So this is the other end of the Austrian society, someone obscure but very talented. No, this is
yes.
Ava Fent, who's still alive, though very elderly now. She spent her entire career in East Berlin. She's one of many people in East Germany who had a professional career of an artist despite the odds, and for the majority of her adult life lived off of making and selling art and giving art lessons. And it's hard to see, some of the detail is lost in the reproduction, but she's very good at these very rich aquatints that she uses in a very original way. And it's from a series she made in the mid-70s of Jewish women living in a senior home in East Berlin.
A really pretty
Superb.
magnificent example of engraving technique.
It's a superb engraving by Holzius. So 1589, he's one of the great printmakers of his time. He later turned to painting, but I think he excels especially in printmaking and drawing. The Crocker has a beautiful drawing by him, and I wanted to give a print so you could see just how good an artist he was.
And this was in the Holzius exhibition
Yes.
a few years ago.
Yeah.
Ribera.
Ribera.
So now we're going to someone very central, one of the great Baroque artists who's Spanish but trained in Italy and really flourished in Naples. And it's a very powerful evocation of a martyrdom. And he's extremely good. This is as aggressive a thing as I'm ever going to buy. But he's so good that I like it. And I think it's one of the hardest things to do in art is to show a scene of violence with great care. And it also too operates as a devotional object, I think, quite well.
Well, and it sort of fits in with the Neapolitan theme is something that's,
Yes.
you know, this Solimena that of course many of you know, the Filippo Falciatore, the De Matteis. We actually have several Neapolitan things that
Yes.
sort of, you know, really fit well.
I've always loved Naples. I think it's one of the most interesting cities anywhere. And it has this really interesting artistic heritage. And the Crocker has a sizable painting by Solimena, and that's the first painting by him I ever saw.
Oh, yeah.
And it whetted my interest. Ah, yeah. Giuseppe Cadiz. So this is someone in Rome. This is 1790s. He's an example of a good artist who's better at drawing than he is at painting, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very beautiful evocation. So it's Juno flying in because she knows her husband, Jupiter, is up to no good, as usual. And his sweetheart, Io, has been transformed into a cow in order to make her less visible, but I don't think it's working. And so I love this so much. The thing is, the technique is superb, the storytelling is great, and it also, I think, shows you that the neoclassical period does have a sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the scholars don't,
Right.
but the artists do, and I think it's more, I think neoclassical art is much easier to like when there is some humor.
Yes, well, and what I love is how very coy
Yeah.
she's still seductive even as a cow. You know, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's superb
And
in every way.
this is an area that the Crocker's drawings collection has a sort of core of later Italian being 18th, later 18th century, early 19th, that sort of there have been opportunities in that area in the past 10, 15 years that there sort of really weren't before because
Right.
people weren't paying as much attention. And so it really has found a wonderful home.
Yes. And it's something that Crocker didn't have. Oh, yeah. So this is Fuga, so also neoclassical, also a sense of humor. Also, the technique is superb. This is 1815, so a little bit later. Fuge. So a German artist is actually from the southwest of Germany, from Schwabia, but who had a very interesting career that mainly played out in Vienna and elsewhere.
Yeah, mainly
Right.
Vienna. Yeah.
And he just superb use of the chalk and the ink work, everything. It's just beautifully done. So it's the three graces discovering Cupid asleep, and it's based on a near contemporary literary work that was written in German that is humorous in its approach to these stories.
Yeah.
And I thought it's a wonderful, and it's also the model for a painting, but the technique is so good and the playfulness is so nice. And you know that Cupid is only going to be trouble.
Right. And the 18th century collection already had a Fugger, but
yeah.
from 1785.
Yes.
And so showing him 30 years later is really important.
It's, it's really an interesting, the other drawing.
It was purchased by the Crockers.
Yes, I think so, and a completely different mood. A different technique, different subject, different atmosphere. Oh yeah, so it's much more powerful in person. The reproduction plays down the intensity of the image. But so I do actually like expressionism. You'll see this at some point exhibited, and it's extremely powerful. So this is Oskar Kokoschka, who grew up in Vienna, who's very much part of that Viennese world. And this is, he made in 1918 after he's been discharged from the Austro-Hungarian army because a grenade blew up near him in 1916, and he was traumatized by it. He was sent home, then he went to a sanatorium near Dresden in 1917. In 1918, he starts making art again. This is sort of his return to full vigor as an artist. And a few months after this, he was hired to be a professor at the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts. So it's at this turning point when he starts to become a real star. But I also think it's one of the most powerful depictions of expressionist anxiety. So you can imagine the model, whose name was Corona, was probably this very beautiful young woman. And he does everything he can to make her look racked with anxiety. And there's something very interesting, even though I think it's the majority of art I've ever offered or felt fondly about is in a much more tender register. There is something about the expressionists. In Central Europe, the expressionist movement, I think, is the most powerful 20th century movement to me. And so I keep coming back to it.
Yes, and you'll have a chance to see it in next February, actually.
Oh, good.
Yeah, in an exhibition.
It's very powerful. Oh, yeah.
And then this fascinating,
Yeah.
wonderful, fun thing.
So yeah, Charles Poisson, who was one of the many talented students of Simon Vouet. So it's now 17th century France. This is 1650s. It is the model. It's the modello for a very important commission he received from the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And so this is the small study which he had to submit to get approval from the officials at the cathedral for the May picture, their annual commission by the goldsmiths of Paris. And the final painting has been lost. It's been lost for 200 years, but the modello remains. And it's really interesting, and there is a print I found of the final work, and he was forced to remove, you see the Roman soldier leaning down to bring someone out of the water. That part was considered too unconventional, so it's not in the final picture. The rest of it is a little bit more conservative, so I actually think the Modello is a more interesting composition. But it's also, too, because it's preparatory and not a finished work, it's a little bit freer when you see it in person. And I do like the idea of being able to show visitors how art is made, that there are these many processes. You have various ideas, you make various drawings, you make oil sketches, you need approval, you make the final work, maybe you rework it. And I think it makes art more comprehensible if you see how things are made. But it's just also just a particularly interesting picture.
Yes, yes. And now in our last half hour, we'll be sort of talking mostly about paintings.
Yes.
You know, that's sort of, we've focused more on paintings as time has gone on, which is...
And I'm never going to stop being interested in drawings. It's just that I got over my intimidation factor in the art world in terms of the really fancy galleries and auction houses. And I realized I could start offering more paintings that would be first rate, that would fill gaps in the paintings collection here, and that it was going to be more feasible than I ever thought it would be. And so there too, it's the benefiting from changing taste in the market, and I guess also more confidence on my part.
And so we have, this is sort of one of those gaps that needed filling, which is the sort of current of Greuze, the sort of very sort of focused on the dramas of domestic life,
Yes.
but in a sort of very almost history painting way, and then portraits like this one.
And this is, I love this very much because one of the things that's fascinating to me about the 18th century is that it's also this period in which a number of people start actively rethinking childhood. And there's this shift that occurs in some places that children are no longer seen as defective grown-ups, but that because that's endlessly frustrating, but that childhood exists on its own terms and that you are developing. As a student of psychology, I've always been fascinated by child development. The most serious thing children do is imaginative play. Daydreaming, role-playing, drifting off in your mind, exploring the world, both with your hands and your mind, all of that. That's what's going on here. This is a young boy who probably should be doing his lesson, but I think he's daydreaming, or at least he's thinking about something in a way a child would. And I think it's very compelling, and it's just a particularly beautiful portrayal of a child, and done with great sensitivity. And so we're pretty sure it's by Pierre Xantreville. To my mind, it's more sensitive, more respectful of actual children than the portrayals by Greuze, which are much more famous. Mm-hmm. He doesn't overplay the emotion. I'm sure it is gently idealized, but it's a believable child. And it was very gratifying to me that one of the times I was up in the galleries, shortly after it had been installed, I saw a young girl with her grandmother in the galleries, and the girl was not impressed by most of the art, but she loved this. And so it occurred to me, I started thinking more consciously that it's a good idea to have some works on display that will appeal to children. And if you do that, then you also end up appealing to the child within adults. So it's another way that art is not just one or two things, art is many things, and it's another way to show all the facets of the human experience.